Hello, God's richest blessings to you today. We're going to be starting a 6-part series here called The Easter Resurrection Proves Jesus is God. I'm presenting these 2021 during the Easter season at Oak Road Lutheran Church in Lilburn, Georgia. My name is Andy Rasman. All right, so the Easter Resurrection proves Jesus is God. How do we know the Easter resurrection actually happened? Most people would probably say the Bible. We know about the Easter resurrection from the Bible. Now, to be able to say that the Easter resurrection is true, we would want to then know if the Bible is a reliable historical source to make that claim. And so this first part is to look at the Bible as a historical source and then to ask ourselves, is it a reliable historical source? There are 3 tests for the historical reliability of a document. This is any document. I'm getting these 3 tests from a man named Chauncey Sanders. He's a military historian. He laid out that you have the bibliographical test that you need to apply to a document, the internal test, and the external test. So in brief, the bibliographical test would be asking questions like, is this document a forgery? Is it what it's claimed to be? When was it written? How has it come to us? Has it accurately come to us? If it was written thousands of years ago and we don't have the original copy, does the documents we currently have accurately represent what the original likely portrayed? Then you look at the internal test. This would be things like, is the document internally consistent? Are there contradictions within itself? Is the author conveying that he is sharing eyewitness testimony or hearsay, things along those lines? External tests would then be looking at, are there other documents that would affirm what is inside this document? External tests also could be things that we know, known facts, right? So these would be known facts. Would these known facts support or go against to disprove what is in the document itself? So the internal test and the external test oftentimes run together. So the bibliographical test is where we're going to start. And so has the New Testament documents of the Bible come to us successfully? And I would start with the New Testament documents because it's there in the New Testament documents that we hear mention of Jesus, his claims to be God, and in particular his resurrection, and the resurrection event is what would prove his claims to be God to be true. What we may not think about living in the 21st century when we have many Bibles, all sorts of copies of the Bible, is that when the Bible was originally written, it was written by hand on papyrus. And so much of what was originally written, well, all of what was originally written, no longer exists for us today. So we have copies of the originals. And so this hand copying process, is prone to error. The materials it's written on may not always survive. Bibliographical tests also in terms of dating. When were these copies written? You have to look at the pen, the ink. So what color is the ink? Things like this can tell us dating. Ink changes color over time. So if it's a forgery, we can know that by the color of the ink. If it looks like, you can't really fake an old document, okay, because the ink coloring. You may even look at the type of writing. Style of writing changes over time. When the New Testament documents were originally written, Greek had all capital letters. Well, that changed over time. When they were originally written, Greek had no punctuation. So these are things that, as we start to see those things emerge in the copying, we can decipher when they were written. So the bibliographical test then needs to look at all the different copies that we have and compare them. Were they accurately copied? Do they contain the same text, or was there change from copy to copy? Things like that would be bibliographical test. Concerning the number of copies that we have to compare with one another to see how accurately the original message has been preserved throughout history through the copying process. We have 5,686 copies to look at. Now, we have more than that, but that's the number that was given in 2001 by Norman Geisler, a biblical scholar. Now, when I say 5,686 copies, I don't mean we have 5,686 complete New Testaments or even complete Bibles to be able to look at in the Greek language. But this would be 5,686 Greek manuscript copies. Now, here's an example. One of those 5,686 would be the John Ryland's Papyri. It only contains John 18:31 to 33 and 37 to 38. It dates to AD 110 to AD 140. I got a picture of it there for you. It's not very big at all, is it? It's just a few verses there. Now, John's Gospel is dated from AD 60 to AD 90. So the fact that we have this surviving copy that close, even though it's a few verses, is actually still pretty close to being on the scene of when John's Gospel was written, especially if John's Gospel was written in AD 90. You're looking within decades, we have a surviving copy that it contains at least a few verses. Codex Sinaiticus, this would be one of those 5,000 plus copies that we have. This is the first complete New Testament. It also contains the complete Old Testament. It dates to the middle of the 4th century. Now, why would that number of copies be important? Because when you look at other ancient documents, you see that they do not have as many number of copies. Sometimes it's a couple handfuls. Sometimes it's not even a handful in terms of the number. Okay, so you're looking at sometimes 10 or less copies in a lot of ancient documents. Also, you would want to look at when the document was written versus when the earliest surviving copy is, and see that the Bible has way more copies than most other ancient documents, and the time span between when the document was first written and when the first surviving copies are preserved for us is a lot shorter of a time span than what you see in most documents. So why is having so many surviving copies a good thing for historical reliability? It means we can compare them and see if there is accuracy in the copying. Okay, accuracy in copying is important. Also, we got a paper trail. We got like the John Ryland's Papyri in 2nd century AD. And well, now we can compare it to one copy that we find in the 9th century, and we can compare and go, okay, well, the copy of John that we have in the 9th century has the exact same verses as we see in the John Ryland's Papyri. So we know that those verses in John were accurately copied for that many centuries. Now, in terms of the date of the writing, this chart here breaks down actual Gospels versus Paul's letters, when the author lived, the date of the events recorded in the work written by the author, the date of the writing, then the earliest extant manuscript, and here you see the entire Gospel of Matthew by around 200 AD. So the elapse of the events in the writing to the earliest extant manuscript, and you can see that the Bible has a much lesser time frame and gap, and so some of these events being written by some of these other ancient writers, they may be writing about events that occurred 100, 200, maybe way more years before the author even lived. And so then you throw in the first surviving copy being much later. What it just means is the further the gap is from the events being recorded by the author, the more likelihood of myth having crept into the account, or some sort of breakdown and accuracy of what actually occurred. In terms of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or something we're going to get into, these are people that were writing as eyewitnesses or writing using eyewitness testimony, much more reliable than someone writing about events that occurred before their lifetime. And then the gap just means the larger gap in the copy, first copy surviving, just means we have a larger amount of time in which mistakes or errors could have crept into the copying process, but we don't have the paper trail in order to discern that. Now, I guess about the type of differences that we do see in terms of the mistakes in the copying in the Bible, The Bible is very, very accurate. It's 95% accurate in its copying. The errors that are there are spelling errors, name order switches. One may say Jesus Christ, one may say Christ Jesus, things along these lines. And oftentimes the error, and I've seen this in person from some ancient documents, the error is pinpointed in the margins, a little dot in the line, and there's a dot over the word which shows the error. And I mean, like one letter off, that's an error. We're looking really good here, okay, with the Bible's copying process. So much so that it has been said that if one cannot trust the bibliographical process of the Bible, all of ancient history could not be trusted. That is credited to John Warren Montgomery for making that type of statement. Here's a video I want to play for you. This is from an atheist to kind of show how they respond to the Bible's copying process.
All the things that are supposed to take place in the future are already. How all the prophecies, how completely antiquated they are. Because, when the Bible was written, and then rewritten, and then edited, and then re-edited, and then translated from dead languages, and then retranslated, and then re-edited, and then re-edited, and retranslated, and then given to kings for them to take their favorite parts out, and then re-edited, and retranslated, and then re-edited, and then given to the Pope for him to approve, and then retranslated, and then rewritten, and then rewritten, re-edited, retranslated, re-edited again, all based on stories that were told orally 30 to 90 years after they happened to people who didn't know how to write. So, I guess what I'm saying is the Bible is literally the world's oldest game of telephone.
Yeah. Grand, isn't it? Very grand. So the question then for us then is needs to address is, how is the Bible not like the game of telephone? From what I just described to you, I think it should be pretty easy that the comedian here, David Cross, doesn't understand the process of the copying. We have paper trail, like I said, from the 2nd century all the way through until now with this copying process. So we can indicate and point out if there has been any error changes. And in fact, if you look in your Bible, you can find that we have marked some of these. Like Mark 16, the last chapter of Mark is a good place to do that. Turn to Mark 16. You'll see a line through the middle of that chapter, and it will indicate that the earliest surviving documents do not contain that last portion of Mark. So we point that out. Now, you read that last portion of Mark, it doesn't add or take away anything from the narrative of Jesus' resurrection in terms of making it true or false. Nothing that we see that maybe has been added or taken away, and again, we mark this in our current Bible so we know when this stuff happened, changes doctrine. So he's just off on that regard. I think what he may be thinking about are these books like the Gospel of Judas that emerged, and the church says that's not biblical, that's not canonical, and the Gospel of Judas is not in the Bible. That was not the church changing the Bible. It was the church not recognizing that book to be canonical. And it's because it emerges late in history, wasn't written by an apostle, we know this, was never used in the early church in worship, was not recognized by the apostles. So the stuff like that is what we can use to put aside those types of books. It's not them editing the Bible, it's just rejecting late books as not being from God. So there is a complete and total paper trail. A big difference between this and the game of telephone is we have all the copies. We can put them out and we can look at them and compare them. The game of telephone, you're intentionally trying to make the message hard to decipher. You're not looking at it on paper and copying it. You're hearing it in your ear, whispered, and then passed on. Sometimes the message is intentionally changed to make a funny ending to the game. We don't have that in the copying process with the Bible. So this would be a big distinction and difference. Now we have the internal test that we're going to look at. The internal test asks the questions: does the document indicate that it should be interpreted as fact or fiction? That would be very key. If a person's writing fan fiction, we don't hold it to value. If a person is writing a myth, intentional fictional story, we don't hold it to historical value. Does the author claim to be an eyewitness or reporting hearsay or writing generations removed from the event? All of that makes a difference on how reliable the witness is or the author is. Does the text have internal contradictions that make it unreliable? Does the author make statements that go against known facts? And with that last question, you can see we're already using the external test to be able to have known facts. You can see that in answering these questions, there we go. The external test is already being utilized to affirm the internal evidence of the documents. So in terms, the first question we're going to then look at is who wrote these books. The New Testament has 9 authors. What do these authors say about themselves in their writings? So this is looking at themselves. They claim to be eyewitnesses or wrote based on eyewitness testimony. And I have a list of them there. Luke is a very nice one. Luke actually says that he made an effort to give an orderly account of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And he says that he investigated these things and basically went to the source material. He is recording things that occurred and is conveying information from those that were there from the beginning. So I think that's one reason why Luke contains stories of Jesus' birth. Likely he got in contact with Mary. But you can look through there, and like the John's gospel ends by saying the one that writes this saw it. I testify to this stuff. We see this. 2 Peter 1:16, Peter's saying we saw this with our own eyes. We did not create stories, is what he's saying. Now, if you look at that list, you'll notice Matthew and Mark didn't have a verse citation in it. See? No Matthew and Mark there. So how do we know they are claiming to convey eyewitness accounts? How do we even know that any of the Gospels were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, since they don't say their personal names in their biographies of Jesus? They never say, I am Matthew. I am the tax collector that was called here by Jesus at this time. I followed him. It doesn't say that. And Matthew and Mark, they aren't even listed in that citation as being eyewitnesses. So how would we know that they're conveying eyewitness accounts? And how do we even know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels that they wrote? I have another video to answer this one for you. This is kind of, I think, laying out a lot of the external test evidence here for us on the Gospels that would answer these questions here.
One of the most common claims that Ehrman makes about the Gospels themselves are that they were...
He said Ehrman, he's referring to Bart Ehrman, who was a Christian scholar and actually made a lot of arguments for the resurrection having to have occurred in history, but now he has switched on that stance. So he is the one making these claims that you're about to hear.
Were not written by those names that are on them. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were written by anonymous authors late in the first century. We don't know who these people are, according to Ehrman. They're people that were probably Hellenistic writers outside of Palestine, simply putting down the stories that they heard about Jesus. They weren't eyewitnesses, and we can't be assured that what they're telling us really took place. Now that claim is reiterated often by Ehrman, but there's only one thing that supports that claim. And that only thing that supports that claim is that in the Gospels themselves, they're what we call formally anonymous. What that means is in the text itself, it doesn't say John wrote this or Matthew wrote this. So if you read the letter of Paul, it does tell you that Paul's name is attached to it, but the Gospels are formally anonymous. Now, should that be a concern? Well, actually not. When we think about ancient biographies often were formally anonymous. So the Gospels leaving the names of the author outside the text formally is not at all unusual. So then how do you know who wrote these books? Well, several ways that we conclude that the authors that wrote them are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and simply this: first, the titles of the books. One of the things that Ehrman wants to claim is that the titles that are attached to these documents were added late, probably well into the 2nd century, if not late 2nd century. That's when these titles were added. But that runs into a number of problems. Our earliest manuscripts of these gospel texts all have the titles attached to them, and we can see them. So as far back as we can see, these gospels had the titles with them. But moreover, one has to ask the question, if these titles were a late addition, how is it that we have such uniformity in what these documents were called? If Matthew's Gospel, for example, wasn't called Matthew's Gospel until late in the 2nd century, then why don't we have a number of copies of Matthew's Gospels with different titles, with different names? In fact, we don't possess that. What we find is incredible uniformity across the board. of the titles of these Gospels. Matthew's Gospel is called Matthew, Mark's is called Mark's. It's amazingly consistent, something we would not expect if the titles were added later. Another thing that indicates the titles were added early is the fact that we have Mark and Luke included in the list of titles. One of the things that we know is happening in the 2nd century is that when apocryphal Gospels were written, often titles would be picked that had some of the most popular names attached to them. So you have something like the Gospel of Peter, which was an apocryphal Gospel. People wanted to attach the most popular apostles' names to their Gospel to try to give them extra sort of authority. So if names were arbitrarily chosen for these Gospels in the 2nd century, why would they pick Mark and Luke? These were hardly the most popular figures in early Christianity. There's no reason to think that that would have been an extra boost for any particular Gospel. These aren't the names we would expect to be picked if in fact they were arbitrarily picked in the middle to late 2nd century. In fact, we know from other sources that Mark's Gospel is actually the testimony of Peter. Mark claims that what he's writing down is in fact Peter's words. If so, why not call Mark's Gospel the Gospel of Peter? That makes much more sense. But instead, what we find is it retains the title of the Gospel of Mark, even though that's not the most famous figure you could give to that book. That suggests historical integrity. It suggests modesty. It suggests truth. It suggests that the titles we have in the Gospel very much are the titles of the actual people who wrote them. There's actually more evidence than that for why we know the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That is, we have very strong patristic testimony in this regard. Papias, who was an early church bishop in the early 2nd century, tells us and confirms for us that Matthew was the author of Matthew and Mark was the author of Mark. Papias was said to have heard the Gospel of John preach. If so, then he's only one step removed from the apostles themselves. Also, church father by the name of Irenaeus in the late 2nd century tells us that these 4 Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Where would Irenaeus have gotten his information from? Well, we're told in the other early Christian writings that Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle himself. So whatever Irenaeus tells us about the authors of the Gospels, most likely he got that from Polycarp, who got that from the Apostle John. That is a very reliable historical sequence. There are very good reasons to think that Irenaeus knows better who the Gospel authors are than modern scholars. And so if we take him at his word, we have every reason to think the Gospels are written by the names that are attached to them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
All right. So I want to share some of those quotes. I don't want to repeat everything he said. I think it was really good. If you didn't catch it, maybe go back and listen to what he said. I think it's explained very clearly. But I wanted to give some of those quotes that he was referring to, people outside of the apostles that had a good connection to the apostles that we can then trust when they say who wrote which gospel. And just so you can hear it yourself, okay? So this is a quote from Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis. He was a disciple of John. This is recorded by Eusebius. So this is someone else that recorded the words of Papias, okay? The elder used to say this also. Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately all that he, Peter, mentioned, whether sayings or doings of Christ, not, however, in order, for he was neither a hearer nor a companion of the Lord. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who adapted his teaching as necessity required, not as though he were making a compilation of the sayings of the Lord. So I think this is awesome. Maybe you have always heard pastors or teachers tell you that the Gospel of Mark is really Peter's, that Mark was writing down what Peter said. But how do you know that? Because Mark's Gospel never says, I'm recording what Peter said. Have you ever called out your pastors? How do you know that? Probably you haven't. You just trust them. This is where we're getting it from historically. And you see here that he's making efforts to not add or take away from what Peter said, that when Peter's speaking, he never gave a direct blow by blow. This is how everything happened. But he spoke and recounted what happened with Jesus as necessity required it based on what was going on in the day-to-day in front of his face life. So then Mark made no mistake writing down in this way some things as he, Peter, mentioned them, for he paid attention to this one thing, not to admit anything that he had heard, not to include any false statements among them. Here's a quote from Irenaeus, a disciple of Polycarp, a disciple of John the Apostle. So this is basically third generation Christian here. Matthew published his gospel among the Hebrews in their own language. That's amazing. So Matthew would have been written in Aramaic or Hebrew here. And that hasn't survived to us. When Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and founding the church there, so he even tells us when Matthew wrote the gospel. After the departure, that is death, which strong tradition places in the time of the Neronian persecution in 64, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter himself, handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. I know a lot of people say Mark was written first, but according to Irenaeus here, it sure seems as if Matthew was written first, which may indicate why we got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John. That's the order in which they were written. Mark, the disciple and interpreter Peter himself, handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by his teacher. Then John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast, this is reference to John 13:25 and 21:20, himself produced his gospel while he was living at Ephesus in Asia. External evidence here, guys. This is how we know who wrote the gospels, even though they are formally anonymous, as Dr. Bear Ehrman accurately points out there, but seems to not do a good job recognizing that when the gospels were actually written and who wrote them, based on the evidence. And he also said, for as there are 4 quarters of the world in which we live, and 4 universal winds, and as the church is dispersed over all the earth, and the gospel is the pillar of the church and the breath of life, so it is natural that it should have 4 pillars, breathing immortality from every quarter, and kindling the life of men anew. Whence it is manifest that the Word, the architect of all things, who sits upon the cherubim and holds all things together, having been manifested to men, has given us the gospel in the fourfold form, but held together by one Spirit. Awesome. So he's just pointing out here in the 2nd century, we're already being told there are only 4 gospels, and it was Irenaeus here saying that this makes sense to him, that this is how the creator of the world would have designed things, to have only 4 gospels. And so as David Cross maybe was indicating, it seems as if the church is picking and choosing and editing and taking out things they don't want. He's probably referring to all these other books that we do not recognize to be biblical, and it's because the early church from the beginning only recognized 4 gospels. There's another early church father named Tatian who in 175 AD, I believe that's the date, it's in the 170 range, he put together a compilation of the 4 gospels. Maybe you've done this yourself, where you're reading the gospels, you go Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you flip back and forth between the gospels to see their chronology, to see their details or differences. He basically compiled the 4 in a chronological order, putting their events side by side, filling in the gaps, trying to make a chronological compilation of the 4 gospels. This is back in the 2nd century, so they already only recognized 4 gospels. He wasn't using 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different gospels to do that process. So this, everything I presented here would be the bibliographical, internal, and external test information applied to the Bible as a historical document. Okay, this is just the first step in showing that the Easter resurrection proves Jesus is God. Okay, so the resurrection shows Jesus is God. We know largely about this resurrection from the Bible. We need to look at it as an historical document. We're doing that. And so this, what we just had, what I just shared, was the first step in this 6-part series. First, the Bible is a reliable historical source. Then, second part, we're going to look at Jesus' claim to be God. This is important because if he wasn't God and didn't make claims to be God, didn't make claims that his death would be an atoning sacrifice for the sins of the world, then when we get the resurrection, it's meaningless. We don't have any bearing on what it means or why it happened, why it occurred. It would just be the greatest, strangest fluke in history that this crucified criminal comes back to life, okay? But he claimed to be God, okay? Now, we're going to take a look at that. Some of us that grew up Christian, we would just sit here and go, well, duh, he claimed to be God. Of course he's God. But have you ever looked at the Bible? Does he actually say, I am God anywhere? And there are people like the Muslims, people like the Jehovah's Witnesses, they will point out that Jesus never claimed to be God, never claimed to be truly divine and eternal. So these are people today that make those claims, and we should address their claims and arguments. And this is a step that you may have to take before you get through the rest of it. And so after we should look at that, then the next step was to see that Jesus did die. Did he actually die? If he didn't actually die on the cross, then maybe it wasn't a resurrection. Okay, he was buried. Do we know where he was buried? Do we know how he was buried? If not, then how do you know he rose from the dead? And then he was raised. There was an empty tomb is what we're going to focus there. So what's the evidence of the empty tomb? But there wasn't just an empty tomb. An empty tomb alone wouldn't do it. So we had people that actually are witnesses that saw him back from the dead. So we're going to look at that. And then we will look at alternative explanations for the evidence. Are there any other explanations besides Jesus being Lord to explain his life, death, and resurrection? And after that, we will close with additional evidence that Jesus is God, because there's just a whole lot there that we can look at. We don't have to do this just as historical documents. We can look at fulfilled prophecy and things like that. All right, anyways, guys, that's part one. Hopefully you can follow through and watch all of these. And if it's 2021 during the Easter season and you want to see these in person, they're presented Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. At Oak Road Lutheran Church in Lilburn, Georgia. Peace in Christ.